Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be speaking in front of so many of you. I think my presentation will actually go really well with what Katrina has already been mentioning, and just will explore a little bit more what it actually means that we talk about heritage participation as politics, what it means to talk about heritage participation as a political act, especially having in mind that most of the times when we think about participation, we think of something that is fostering democratic processes in our societies, so that is making societies much more open, much more plural, and much more democratic and just. So in these 20 minutes or so, I just want that we explore these ideas and see how should we understand and use heritage in order for that to be seen as a political act. And of course, the starting point for this is that I'm just thinking, it's not really showing well, but it doesn't matter. Maybe just the full screen mode. So the starting point for this is actually seeing heritage and understanding heritage as a very political space. So not just as something that has been inherited from the past, out of bloom, not as a static witness of the past, as mostly we were used to see it, but really seeing it always as a process of different negotiations and a process that is socially constructed. And as Katrina was pointing out, this is very obvious when we talk about intangible heritage and the changing aspect of it and the practices that are kind of constantly moving on and adding new things and negotiating. But I think we should also challenge this idea that tangible heritage is very different than intangible, because many would say tangible is always about, heritage is always about intangible aspects. So it's always about values, it's always about meanings that we ascribe to certain places, it's always about the effects and memories of certain generations, and it always gets materialized, sometimes in buildings and stones, sometimes in concerts, sometimes in skills and crafts. So I think this distinction is very, also kind of very dangerous, because it allows us not to question the whole area of intangible heritage, and then just add on intangible one as the new aspect. So just a few images of how heritage works as politics. And it works because it gives us very much defines our image of the world, very much defines how we understand our role in our society, how we understand different social positions of different groups within society, and of course how we understand the boundaries of our society and the others, how we understand the enemies and friends, how we understand the citizens and those who are not citizens, how we understand the roles of different generations. And if we look at it this way, we have much long way to go when we talk about heritage as politics. So this is the dominant picture that you can see in any history museum. This one is the Swedish History Museum, and this is the kind of Gothic or the medieval room, showing only and solely the Western Christian traditions and the Western Christian kind of artifacts, even though in Sweden today there's more than 20 living religions and 20 different religious communities presented. Just to see, can we, Anna-Maria, can we maybe just move this so that, okay, perfect. So, and this is an interesting intervention by an artist, James Webb. If you see the small black points on the floor, these are actually microphones, and he has been collecting different sermons from different religious communities all around Stockholm, putting them all in the same place of this kind of church-like space, so that you can have all these different voices and diversity of religion that exist today. Of course, this is just a temporary artistic intervention, and we should ask why there has not been even the next move to actually incorporate different stories and different artifacts of the peoples who live in Sweden today. Okay, so I think this is again a very famous kind of very familiar image. It's the National History Museum in Athens. And of course, in telling the story about the birth of the nation state, what we see is only man's history. So there's a lot of these heroes, there's a lot of strong guy with mustache, lots of warriors, but then also lots of intellectuals, also only male. So there's evidently a history that is not there, that is not constructed as heritage, and that is still the part of private memories and private spaces, and that's the female history. And of course, when we look at all the different listed objects all around different countries in Europe and the world, what we see mainly are the houses of the rich people, are the sites that represent the nobility, because they are those who have been preserved over time. So you could not safeguard the slums at that point. But then we never hear that this is just one small portion of people who live this way, and we never hear about, okay, what it came, what kind of society it took for some to be very rich and for some not to be even remembered in the future. So these are all things that we really have to take care about, and this is the image of the heritage today. So what heritage does, in fact, and this is something that Bourdieu was very careful when kind of discussing, is that it is a very powerful way to objectify, so to show different, to make the reality seemed as normal through different objects and different sites. So it objectifies the image of the world, but it also makes this very selective worldview seem as objective, as neutral, and as very apolitical. So what it does actually, we are brought up with these images and we take all of these things for granted. We often take them as very normal and very natural, and therefore leave many of the different groups in the society aside. So talking about participation, there's a really powerful promise when we talk about participation. And it is something that has been kind of brought up to the public space as a consequence of democratic deficit, and it did promise the radical democracy. So it did promise the participation of each and every citizen, it did promise the participation of very different social groups. Interestingly, in the last 20 years, together with the rise of talking about participation, what we also witness today is very much the rise of many right-wing political parties, the rise of going back to different traditions that are very backward-looking, and also the rise of kind of going back to the roots in many of discussions that are going on all around Europe in particular. And this is not, I think, what I would claim is that the participation is not enough in order for heritage participation to be understood as politics, because you can participate in many different things. And I think if we are talking about going back to backward traditions, this is a very kind of interesting image of participation today, true living history, and it's been going on all around. It's good for tourism, it's good for community building, it's good for identity building, right? But what it does actually, it promotes really the violence and kind of masculine warlike values when it's enacted. Or this example from MoMA Museum of Modern Art in New York. They had this project, I went to MoMA, and then they invited their visitors to actually add their own impressions or their own comments on what it happened to them when they went to MoMA. And of course, a lot of museums and heritage organizations are learning from this sort of participation that is actually fostering participation as a marketing tool. And this is what MoMA learned as well, following many of the companies that are today embracing participation. And they're embracing it in order to create communities around their brands, in order to foster consumption, and in order to kind of decrease their marketing budgets because the consumers themselves can act as a spokesperson. So this is also participation and the image of the participation today. And finally, what we see in many museums across the world is something that is interactive museography. So you are there entering the museum, you can touch screens, you can choose content and so on, and it's sort of participative. But what it actually does it is a participative consumption. So you're consuming already made messages, already made meanings, already created kind of meaning making and heritage selected from the side of professionals. So you're not really participating in the kind of social change that we consider when we talk about participation. Is this participation fostering democracy and social change? I wouldn't say so. So I think we need many more ingredients than just participation if we want participation to be really political. And well, here are 5 ingredients that I think are very important, so I'm looking forward to kind of add on them when we have discussion. So first is taking citizens as political subjects. And that means they are not consumers, they are not masses that are kind of wearing their warrior-like suits and kind of jumping around, but they are people with their own desires, their own identities, their own political views, needs, interests, and so on. And all of these have to be put in the public space and articulated. Secondly, what I think is really different when we talk about heritage than about some other aspects of social life is that if we want to understand heritage not as a static witness of the past that we enact as a dogma, but understand it as some sort of account or the mirror of the changing values, something that Katrina was also pointing out. So in what we select in different times, in different periods, that is the account of different social relations, different world orders, different power structures for that particular time. And I think this is very powerful because most of the people who are not educated in heritage, sociology, humanities, and so on, see the current world order as something that is given, as something that is totally normal and natural, and have really limited kind of tools for criticizing it. And I think what we have as a potential in heritage is that actually heritage can be the account of these changing realities and of different negotiation processes throughout the history. Of how, for example, just take the female history and the 8th of March and what this holiday tells and how difficult it was to fight for the women's position today. For many who do not know that history, this position is just taken for granted and it's not invited them to act further upon it. So there is a big potential of seeing heritage as this transformative value. And then, of course, you add to that the critical thinking and asking people to ask critical questions about the current kind of societies, about the current hegemonies, so what is normal and what is desirable today. Multivocality, so it's not enough to have citizens as political subjects belonging to intellectual groups or to political elites. They already see themselves as political subjects and already shape very much the political reality of today's society. So inviting different groups, different marginalized groups to also have their say, and that is really the way towards multivocality, the understanding and dialogue. When saying that, that means not only respecting the other's point of view, but really being able to get into the conversation where we will be able to also change each other's point of view at some point. So being really open for having that discussion in the place that is like a Greek agora. And finally, not limiting the discussion only to heritage and the past, because this is really the crucial ingredients of politics. That is how we decide on our futures. So once you have opened these questions by looking at heritage and different value regimes, what it takes is really the social imagination, so imagining and articulating different alternatives for the future of society as the final step. And here are just few of the examples that I think were really good in doing some of these things. This is the project from Kotor, from Montenegro, called History That Doesn't Exist. And it deals with female history in the city of Kotor in a society that is known as very, very patriarchal. So there's no account whatsoever in public spaces and public institutions of the contribution of women in building the Montenegrin society. What this group did is they were having public kind of open invitations for the citizens to collect the memories, the photos, the archives, and so on, that can tell the history of different women in Montenegro. They not only collected it, they digitalized it and put it on the web, so it is preserved. They formed a sort of new area of heritage. And then they were also doing these exhibitions in the public spaces. If you didn't want to be confronted with that, you had to be confronted just passing the spaces. So you didn't have to go to a museum in order to see this. And they were using that as a platform for talking about the position of women in Montenegrin society today. Another example, very famous one, comes from Baltimore Historical Society. And the story about Baltimore is that there is the majority of Afro-American community. So Afro-American community is the majority in Baltimore. However, in this historical society, the Historical Museum of Baltimore, there was no a single story about that community. They invited the artist Fred Wilson, who is from Afro-American origin, but then he invited members of the Afro-American community into something that he called mining the museum, meaning that they used museum and museum storage as a minefield, so digging some of the stories and some of the objects and in the collections that were not displayed, but they were also making the museum theirs. Interestingly, they didn't choose to add just another exhibition of Afro-American community, but to actually intervene and create the dialogue with the existing permanent collection. And what you see here, it's the silver work kind of part that shows the kind of applied arts of that period. But then in the middle of it, they put the slavery chains. And this is a really powerful method of kind of making this kind of interaction between what is hidden and what is what is presented as totally normal and as the object of just the aesthetic enjoyment. So it's not about the aesthetics anymore. Now it's about thinking, okay, on which basis is the American society built, who is presented, who is not presented, and so on. Everyone who passed through this project as a participant from the Afro-American community, it was a very political act to them, having their voice and having their say in the permanent collection. But also whomever visits the museum, you cannot help but having all those questions in mind, right? Whose role is what, and so on. And finally, the project from Valencia that shows really well this kind of interaction between tangible and intangible heritage, and the community work that is kind of at the basis of it. It won the Europa Nostra award a few years ago, and it all started as a protest against the new development that is being built. So these kind of high-story hotels that are being built on the shores of Valencia. This is a fisherman's village, and it's very, very particular in terms of its stories and buildings and so on. And even though there's quite some shabby buildings, it has a particular charm and particular heritage that they wanted to preserve. So what they were doing, they were engaging citizens not only in protesting, but really in collecting the memories, the stories, different customs related to that whole neighborhood, so that they were actually building up the accounts and archives of the heritage there. And importantly, they called it Cabanal Archivo Vivo, which means living archive, indicating that they do not want Cabanal to just be put in the archive as something that has been perished and can now be assessed only through the historical records, but actually that this is the archive that is going to live and that is going to survive and change and so on. So they were very successful in this in the end. Cabanal is still there, very much vivid and living. But the point of all those three examples is that this is the invitation for us as heritage professionals not to see participation as a good per se. You can participate in very different things, and you can participate both in good and bad processes. So in order to have participation that is really bringing meaningful social change and that is really making more democratic and more just societies, we have to have all those other ingredients in mind. Thank you.